Time to put your galleons where your mouth is. By Tsume Yuki. Epilogue. The Absent Scar. Lily Potter, nee Evans, was a happy woman. At 22 years old, she was happily married to the love of her life, even if she'd never have thought so during her early years of school, even denying it furiously. But here she was, married to one James Charles Potter, with 2 babies wandering around her home and quite possibly another on the way. She hadn't checked yet. It was too early to tell, but she had a good feeling about it. She was beyond happy, actually. Nothing could ever bring her down. Ever! Life had really started to look up in her 4th year with the defeat of the Dark Lord. His trial had gone on for months afterwards, and while hundreds were calling for his head to be splattered across Diagon Alley, that had not come to be. By rights of being the defeater, Turais Black had seen to it that the man be forced to live out the rest of his natural lifespan as a squib, imprisoned and forced to accept the fact he'd become what he once hunted down. None of the Death Eaters left had really fought the eldest Black after that. The fact he could rip their magic away meant they went quietly to prison, more than terrified that they'd be the next one to suffer Turais Black's wrath. The utter Umbra had done his best to live a quiet life, but between his Dark Lord defeating and Owl/Newt record-breaking, he hadn't really succeeded no matter how much he tried. He hadn't changed, though. He still looked out for his brothers and all those that associated with them. He was still the kind of boy she'd met on the train in her first year. Lily considered him a good friend, and she knew he'd grown on James since they'd left school, especially after little Harry and Marigold had been born. Considering that Turais could always calm them down, James had taken to worshipping him as if he were some god in human form, a reaction probably born from countless sleepless nights. Currently, Lily was burping a 2-month-old Marigold, twisting around to get a good look at the duo sat up to her kitchen table. It was November the 1st, 1981, and James was off pulling a shift with Sirius at the Aurora office. Her husband and his best friend had gone on to form a partnership in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. They were talented and well-trained, considering they'd gone to Turais for help with that. Peter had gone on to write the first full book about the war against Voldemort. A fact that had bemused Turais, and the look on his face was anything to go by. Nevertheless, the Black had promised to offer up some references for the Marauder. What was perhaps the most surprising thing was that Turais hadn't gone on to become an Auror and was instead in the process of mounting his own expedition team to go and search for ancient wizarding civilizations and their secrets. A job that would take him and his team around the world. He recruited Remus, poor Remus, who couldn't find a job in the wizarding world due to his condition, alongside Regulus, Rabastan Lestrange, and the fresh from Hogwarts, Barty Crouch Jr. They were just finishing up their planning for their intended route around the globe, and they'd be departing come New Year. Lily was going to miss them. But Remus had promised to write to her, for there was no doubt Sirius would be getting news from both his brothers. They were supposed to have left just before Halloween, but had decided to stick around until Sirius's firstborn came into the world. His wife, Lucy Black, nee Manners, was expecting a baby boy due in early December. Regulus had jokingly promised to look for an ancient crib while they were off around the world. Mama? Looking over at Harry, who stared back at her with his big green eyes, Lily smiled. Yes, sweetie? Ooh! He cried, clapping his hands together and pointing at the Black sat beside him. When Turais had first seen Harry this morning, there had been something a little off about him. He'd still been himself, but it was like he was almost puzzled over something. He brushed Harry's black bird's nest to a side, running his elegant fingers across the boy's forehead before letting out a sigh of relief at discovering unmarked skin. It was almost like he'd come to the house expecting something momentous to have happened in regards to her son. But Harry had clearly not ticked whatever box he was looking for, and Turais had let out a sigh of relief. Lily had ignored it because he'd been the exact same when she'd announced herself pregnant, especially when she'd mentioned she was due late July. Turais had laughed, muttering something about the 7th month dying. But he'd been right. Harry James Potter had come into the world on the 31st of July, the same day as Turais' birthday. Sirius had joked that they could enjoy joint birthday parties, but quickly retracted the statement when Turais had mentioned the classic pin the tail on the donkey game. Do you really think you're going to find something on this trip around the world? Lily asked, carefully laying Marigold down within the small cot that now rested in the living room. Turais had picked Harry up, spinning him around and listening to the kid laugh. It wasn't until the door opened that Harry wiggled free with a cry of, "Ah!" indicating just who was coming into the house. I'm hoping to find the tomb of the Roman Emperor Renatus. The Wizard Emperor? People have been looking for that tomb for hundreds of years and not found it. Turais gave her one of those smiles then. It was always the same one that said he knew something she didn't. I've got a credible lead. Promise. Harry, now having returned from greeting his father, threw himself into Turais' arms, laughing as the older Black picked him up again. I've got to go now, Harry. So be good for your parents, okay? Okay! Turais grinned, passing Harry into her arms before heading to the flue after offering James a farewell. Lily almost missed the way he looked back at Harry, curiously tracing the lightning bolt scar upon his own forehead. The defeater of old Voldemort was strange, but he was her friend, and Lily wouldn't have him any other way.